What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at Avowed, following Xbox's Developer Direct showcase yesterday from the time of this video, where we got a fresh look at this title alongside several others. And I'm happy to say that this particular showing of Avowed was much more promising and seemingly better received than their initial gameplay trailer. Though before we dive fully into that, just as an aside, I think the Indiana Jones game that they showed off really stole the show in most cases. That game looks great. I definitely plan on reviewing that now, and Visions of Mana also looked pretty good. I'll likely take a look at that one as well. But today we're here to talk about Avowed. So, if you're unaware, and just to cover my bases, Avowed is an upcoming first-person fantasy RPG set in the world of Aora, or the Pillars of Eternity franchise. However, Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 were both isometric CRPGs, whereas this is clearly going in a bit of a different direction. I love that world. I love the original two games. One of the things I did before I started doing this full-time was a huge lore series on the world of Aora, so I was pretty much already in on whatever it is they do here. That said, the initial gameplay trailer for this one was a bit underwhelming, and that's mostly because they focused on combat and things like that, which, while certainly important in what is ultimately an RPG, is never going to be the game's strongest point, whereas in this particular showcase, the entire thing seemed to have a much more cohesive direction, both in terms of definitely combat, but also more specific to RPG things like choice, consequence. They even introduced a new, I believe, companion from the looks of it, so there's a fair bit to go over. First, they led with a small introduction to what Avowed is, specifically that it is taking place in the Living Lands, and they wanted to capture what that means in terms of the landscapes and things you'll be interacting with, but also the story. The Living Lands are a mostly unsettled territory to the north that, as the name would kind of imply, is teeming with untamed wildlife. It does have a few small settlements, though. We are taking on the role of an envoy from the Adir Empire. Because of this, your envoy can either be human or elf, so the race choice is a little limited there, but they did discuss a tiny bit of what is to come, which is to say that we'll be uncovering all sorts of secrets in the Living Lands, of course, both in regards to the already mentioned spiritual plague that is plaguing, of course, the Living Lands, which is almost certainly something to do with animancy given the setting, which is the study of the soul, which is a very clearly defined thing in this universe. But in addition to that, they let slip that something we discover, some secret in the Living Lands, will be very personal to our character, which is especially cryptic given the nature of the Living Lands at large. So it'll be curious to see how that pans out. But from there, they did go on to talk a bit more about combat, and luckily this was again a much improved showing from the original gameplay trailer, but I do think it's still important to mention that as an RPG, there's going to be a big emphasis on choice and consequence, nuanced moral decisions, etc. that Obsidian is pretty well known for. And while we don't have full details of things like the progression systems and whether or not they're pulling much of anything from the original titles, which we'll talk about momentarily, in terms of its combat systems. And because of that, it's hard to really look at combat and be like, this is what they should improve, because I don't know if this is stat-based, if it's simply equipment, or how exactly that's going about working. And when you're looking at combat that is based off stats and numbers, the physical representation of that in the game world is never going to be quite up to par. Nonetheless, though, I do think this is looking a lot better than their initial trailer, and they showed off a wide variety of weapons and approaches. For starters, you'll be able to equip a large variety of items in terms of swords, shields, daggers, wands. Guns are a thing in this universe, so you'll have some more primitive versions of those even. There's dual wielding, so it looks like you'll be able to equip something to each hand. And what's more, you can save these setups to loadouts that you can swap on the fly to keep you in the combat. And while they didn't go super deep into it, it does appear that there will be a fair few enemy mechanics to deal with, and there's the usual stuff, blocking, parries, things that you would expect from a first-person title essentially, but also more interesting enemy mechanics such as enemies performing the function of a healer or a tank, and you having to decide how to approach groups of enemies and which enemies to take out first, which is something that I think is a little more akin to their isometric roots. In addition to just weapons and things though, you will be, of course, getting things like abilities and special attacks, which seem to mostly consist of a few spells that I'm aware of in the universe, and pretty much what you would expect from a fantasy RPG. However, this is the part of the video where I want to talk a little bit about some ambiguity here in terms of what they're pulling from Pillars of Eternity, if anything, outside of just kind of winging it. As they seem to imply, you can mix and match this stuff basically at will, which is probably the way to go for a game like this, but it does, to me at least, call into question how much, if anything, of the lore for the classes and professions, if you will, from the isometric games is carrying over. Because Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 has some really cool classes in things like the Chanter or the Cypher, who utilize magic in really unique ways. And what they've shown here in this trailer shows a mishmash of a lot of those different things and didn't really give an answer one way or the other in terms of how, if at all, they're trying to adapt those mechanics to this game, or if they're just looking at it from a more free-for-all approach. But for me, that's questions I have looking at this. And as they start to share more information about the game is one of the things I'll be keeping an eye out for. Now from there, they went on to discuss a little bit of the game's choice and consequence system, which I think is great and one of the things the original trailer was lacking, as this is meant to be an RPG, so just showcasing purely combat and things like they did originally was a bit underwhelming. Here though, they discussed a short side quest you could get up to in one of the areas of the game you can explore, where you'll stumble across a bunch of dead bodies, which leads to a discovery of people who fled from a battlefield, and you have to decide how you're going to deal with that situation and what the choices and outcomes could be. This also gave us a look at a few of the different races in the world, such as the Amawa here, and this is where we also got a look at Giada, who appears to be a potential companion and a magic wielder of some description, and while we didn't really get any other details, still a cool one. I will say though, I think a little bit of the voice acting for one of the characters here was a bit iffy, but then they ended the showcase talking about the living lands themselves and their approach to tackling some of the art direction in this regard, and one of the things they really focused on was contrast, bringing these really vibrant areas next to something more dull and refined, or areas just verdant and lush with life next to areas that are sickly and dying, presumably from that spiritual plague we mentioned. And I think one of the nice things about setting a game in this area of the world is that A, it's largely unexplored, so they can come up with some stuff here, but the land here is extremely untamed, which means you're going to see all sorts of crazy flora and fauna next to things like dramatic mineral springs, toxic swamps, and kind of just the run of any given environment you could think of could potentially be here, as some areas of the living lands are said to have never been seen by mortal eyes. So there's a lot to play around with there in terms of the art direction, and for me, I think the art is probably one of the most striking things about this game, and I loved what they had to show off. Most of it is incredibly dramatic. Even the stuff that looks a little more plain still has this very distinct quality to it that I think, despite it being 3D, manages to capture a lot of the style from the original two isometric titles, which was certainly nice to see. Though, that does pretty much conclude everything they had to show at this particular showcase. And to summarize and kind of wrap this up, while I still have a few things of hesitation here and there about certain elements, things like the combat, how they're integrating anything class-wise from Pillars of Eternity, alongside other things that we just don't know yet, like the scale of certain explorable locations, etc. And all of that we'll simply have to wait for more information on. But by and large, this particular showcase was a dramatic improvement from their initial gameplay trailer, and as someone who is excited for more of this world and universe, I was very happy to see. That though is pretty much going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, hope you found all of this interesting, or maybe enjoyed some of the extra context I was able to give in certain situations, but do let me know how you feel about all of it down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, stick around while we wait for this game's release later in fall of this year. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.